Hey guys, welcome back. Looking at part 5 of our kind of little video review discussion talk series on scientific principles of strength training. Last time we did SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation curves, and how they apply and how can they determine training frequency. Before that we've done part 1. Again, these are in order of importance, if you remember. Most important, specificity, guiding direction for training, like your roadmap of how the hell you're going to get where you want to get, and making sure everything you do is a step in that direction. Overload, making sure things get generally harder over time. Fatigue management, managing fatigue and general variables that you can control to ensure recovery is maximized. Then we did stimulus recovery adaptation and their curves and how they apply and blah 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 blah. This time, we're talking about variation, the next most important thing. I mean, it's not next most, we're like 5 deep, so you know, the next thing on the list. So, what is variation? Exercise selection is probably the most common one that people know about. You can vary, like, rep ranges, you can vary total volume ranges, so again, we've talked about volume amounts, and how you can ping between your two kind of volume landmarks. You can vary, like, how far up and down you kind of ping in that. You can vary rep ranges, metabolite loads. Again, you can vary, like, training frequency as long as it's not going to negatively impact, like, the long-term idea of training. And, again, not super... kinda, you can vary velocity as well. That kind of usually will apply in a sport-specific context, just cause there's more application of velocity-based training type things and plyometric type shit in sport training than powerlifting, just because everything in powerlifting is closed chain, so who cares. Why do we want to vary stuff at all? Because if you do the same shit for too long, you will run into adaptive resistance. The resistance to adaptation, as we've talked about in our previous videos. You create stress, you recover from stress, you adapt. If you stop adapting because you essentially repeat the same stuff over and over with absolutely no difference, you are like blunting your stimulus. But you essentially become resistant to the stress in that you adapt to it so often that you're just like, well, it's not really a stress anymore, I'm kind of used to this. You also skirt the issue of any kind of RSI, which is quite common in powerlifting. That's like a repetitive strain injury, essentially like putting... You might have heard to, like, essentially fucking lifting, moving in a certain way, referred to as like a motor pattern or a motor engram. Essentially doing like exactly the same thing over and over and over again without any difference will essentially repetitively strain some of the connective tissue involved. Again, we talked about it last time in SRA, that if you don't give your connective tissue stuff at least some time to recover, you don't need to fully let it come back again unless you're injured, but then again, that's a totally different thing. That's the kind of stuff you'll run into. Essentially, if you don't change up what tissues are stressed, how much, how often, blah blah blah, you will essentially annoy them to the point that it will just make you take time off training because you've hurt them a lot. How long before we start encountering adaptive resistance to training stuff? Usual kind of guideline stuff via the text that we're talking about. About 12 weeks in terms of volume and intensity ranges. Exercise selection, you can argue based on qualification will matter more, I think. Because until you have at least an intermediate level of lifting, especially if you define intermediate as when you start consistently having the same problem. So like when you're a beginner, you're unconsciously incompetent, like you suck and you don't know why. When you start knowing that you suck and why, and it's exactly the same thing every time, I've seen that used by big old Max Montana from JTS as a definition of being intermediate, and I think that's quite good, because it is quite a weird definition for when you become an intermediate lifter, because you're not amazing, but you don't suck, so... So I thought that was quite cool. But yeah, I'd argue that especially because your qualification will be low, and you essentially technique-wise suck enough that you can't essentially do the pattern consistently enough to occur and like run into these problems. It matters less. It doesn't matter. It's not negligible. I just think it matters less than if you are like dead on the money every time, like intermediate to advanced lifting. Then it matters a bit more. I think, especially with regards to keeping the competition lifts in. But you will tend to change them anyway for a point that we're going to get onto now. So, variation will typically lend itself better, especially if you're thinking it will become more intuitive, especially if you are thinking about the other things that we've talked about in terms of stacking up training for different goals per different mesocycles. So having specifically hypertrophy focused blocks, like we talked about, just whole-assing one thing. So if muscle gain is the goal, just work towards that. Don't mix in any strength related things or any maximal lifting at all. It's just hypertrophy, because why wouldn't you? If you want to get better at that one thing, and then just stack the other thing on top of it later. It kind of lends itself to that, in that because you're looking for a specific goal of gaining muscle, you can alter your exercises a bit far, like a couple steps away from the competition lifts, and make them a bit more specific to the muscles that you are trying to increase. So, for example, you might compete low bar squat, or mid to low bar squat position. It might be reasonably hip dominant. It's definitely not going to be like high bar close stance, like with a lot of forward knee travel in competition. It might, but it might not. Especially if you're reasonably experienced in powerlifting and definitely have the ability to squat like that, you're going to try that, because that's probably your most advantageous leverage set. But when you come out of it, again, you might want some quad stuff, especially if you suck like in/just outside of the hole, where knee extension is mostly going to be governed by quads at that angle. You're going to want more quads, so you're going to probably need to do some quad hypertrophy, which would be pretty cool to do with some close stance high bar stuff, again, assuming you can do it and not suck at it to the point where you can't get any training effect out of it because you just suck that bad. Yeah, so you can vary up exercise selection that way, in that different exercises are better suited towards different block goals or different mesocycle focuses. So that in itself will vary exercises. It will also vary volume ranges and intensity ranges, because hypertrophy, volume, and intensity ranges, volume is way up, intensity is kind of like low to middling, because again, you're chasing the volume more than anything else. The rep ranges and metabolite loads compared to strength training, again, way higher, way different. Training frequency, again, will probably change, especially depending on how much volume you're chasing. You might have to spread it out over more days, or you might just add in more muscle group and more isolation specific stuff, especially if you're focusing on weak point or like weak point training, weak point muscle training type stuff. Again, going back to our thing of conscious, like you're essentially beginner, like early intermediate, later intermediate, advanced type thing. When you have the same the same breakdown in problem, if you have done a needs analysis and are like, right, I always miss my squat like an inch out of the hole because my quads are weak as fuck, and I hip shift and then I lose it because I can't like good morning the weight out, or I hip shift it and then good morning it out and it's a total grind and it leaves me totally fried for deadlift, like my position could be better. The way to modify that out of the hole, assuming you could plan both ends, so rather than be like, it's definitely me just not paying attention and hip shifting rather than just grinding through my weakest point, or it's definitely a quad weakness, that's why I'm shifting, instead of identifying between the two, because you could address one in a strength block with loads of paused and tempo work, and one in a hypertrophy block with smoking a load of quads, you can kind of hit it from both sides and try and kind of eliminate the guesswork and just do both. So, yeah, I think that might be a bit more useful to approach it from this way. So, for an example of varying and like a little bit of programming structure or like theory of why you would do stuff, do a meet. Your squat sucks out the hole, like, just out the hole, you hip shift, you do that, like, stripper hip where you dip your chest and then have to, like, good morning the weight up. You make the squat, but it's hard as fuck, and you're totally fried. Your deadlift maybe doesn't go as well because of that. You think you might, like, have jacked your low back up a bit. Again, it generally sucks. How could you fix that? Well, hip shifting is essentially shifting onto your hips because they are stronger than your quads, and you will go up. Again, this is very typical in people that have... Especially if your deadlift and squat are very different and your deadlift is way higher, you will very likely encounter this problem. You occasionally see people who have a very hip hinge, they just fucking commit to the hip hinge squat, like they do like a table impression and like torso level is like that. Again, they'll have an extremely vertical shin, whereas a lot of people will kind of like stay a bit more upright and lean up. They will like pancake over and then come back up. Typically, their deadlift and their squat are almost fucking identical, because it's essentially, like, 6 deadlifts at that point. And if you commit to that and can do it, do it. Like, it's reasonably viable. There are, like, definitely good squatters to do that, however, it obviously comes with its own set of limitations. The fact that you pretty much have to definitely count squat and deadlift together in... your total volume, considering you aren't altering a lot of the muscles used because you're doing pretty much a good morning slash deadlift for all of your squats, means that your training volume and training variance has to be around those two being similar rather than normal people who have differences in both of those. Anyway, so you've identified that as a problem. Sweet. So... depending on how beat up you are, you might want to cycle in like a week or two of prehab mesocycle type or microcycle type stuff, of like foam rolly type stuff, along with a deload. Don't go cold turkey after training, after a meet. That's a terrible idea. Don't like peak and then immediately hit zero. Like, don't do that. Like, try and cruise down. Do training to like close to maintenance volume, to like minimum effective volume, and just try and like step your way down a little bit, like spin the wheels, don't dead stop. You'll hurt yourself more likely. So planning wise, what you could do is be like, right, sweet, I'm gonna hit a quad specific hypertrophy block. So you could vary in terms of variation. You're obviously varying what you are used to, so you've just come out a strength and a peak block for your meet. You're varying in changes in volume because you're working up more towards like 8s, 10s, 12s, 15s, 20s if you're fancying it. Like, not that often though, that's like some psychopathic once a month type stuff. Intensity range is changing dramatically. Again, you've gone from like your 90 circa max type stuff in peaking to 60 to 75% for hypertrophy loads, again, depending on what rep range you use. See video number 2 of overloading. It has to get harder over time, so start low and work up and over hard, whatever. Changes in rep range and metabolite load, again, that kind of goes in hand with the volume stuff, well, with the hypertrophy stuff of you're trying to get hypertrophied, so you are not training in singles and 5s, you are training in 7, 8, like 8s, 10s, 12s, all that kind of stuff, high up. Exercise selection, though, one that we were just talking about, so instead of your normal kind of like mid to low bar, kind of slightly wide competition stance, maybe in flats, you change to maybe a heel chew, bring the stance in, get high bar, get really upright torso, and squat like balls deep, assuming again you can maintain an extended to neutral low back, and squat hella deep, because you have to squat hella deep to hit your quads in squat. Again, if you have this whole like, I can't feel my quads when I squat, it's probably because you're not deep enough, and with enough forward knee travel. You need to... Forward knee travel isn't a bad thing. You're not going to hurt your knees. It's very rarely going to happen. One thing that might be worth a caveat is, depending on how thick the knee sleeves you wear are, don't excessively forward knee travel if you're wearing hella thick knee sleeves, because you can actually get some like gapping from where the material gets squashed at the back of your knee that can cause some irritation at, like, on ACL style stuff. So watch out for that. Fucking fun tip. Changes in frequency, again, you can bump up squat training, especially when you're training for hypertrophy. You could bump it up to, you could do like 3 hard sessions a week if you were only doing 2 or 3 in your strength block. It depends entirely on people, again, your qualification. So yeah, changing it and going after some quad gains with like a closer, it doesn't have to be like heels touching, just closer than competition, and maybe heel elevated to get more forward knee travel depending on how much your ankle range sucks, or if you are one of those people who are supremely mobile and have perfect proprioceptive control, you can just up the bar, up the torso posture, and just cruise forward and get hella quad gains. Within our little metaphorical hypertrophy block, how often should you be varying in that? Well, again, depends on how often you're going to be training hypertrophy-based stuff. If you're going to do working on the general theory that, like, the longer you have to prepare, and if you can maximally use that time effectively, the better the outcome will be at the end. So, like, having as much time as possible, if you could theoretically do almost the maximum possible before you would essentially exhaust all variants and need to change up just based on the stimulus you're chasing. So for hypertrophy and strength, usually those are like, essentially the training stimulus cap is about 3 months, 12 weeks. So if you had a training cycle where you got 12 weeks of volume followed by 12 weeks of strength and then a peak at the end, that's insane. Like, the difference you could make with all of that time and all of that training, again, assuming it's decent and follows all the other kind of principle stuff we've been talking about, is absolutely mental. Like, you could put some ridiculous numbers up by doing, if you have that kind of time. Again, the fun part comes in the fact that you rarely get that kind of time, because if you're trying to exceed qualification totals, you end up qualifying for stuff, then there's nationals, then there's blah, and you have to prepare kind of as you go, and you don't get like a nice little, a nice large chunk of time to yourself. However, if you're a beginner and you're only going to be doing meets kind of as and when, and it doesn't really matter, you don't have a schedule, you should definitely be doing this, because this is how to definitely maximize your potential, really. Or get the most out of it. Again, stacking up things next to each other in terms of blocks or phases comes under phase potentiation, which is the next video. Essentially, like, putting things in a nice little order in which they will maximally benefit each other, so that the outcome long term is optimal. But that's for another video. So, how often to vary stuff? Again, talking about exercise selection, or just talking about them all in, like, a fairly similar context. It depends, again, on your qualification and how quickly you will run into adaptive resistance, which gets more likely as you become more qualified. So, like, for example, if you are, like, 10 plus years of training advanced, you will probably need to change stuff up every 1 to 2 mesocycles, being months of training. Again, people tend to use mesocycle rather than months because that sets it to a particular time frame, and it might be longer than a month, especially if you do 4 weeks and then 1 deload. So if you cycle up for 4 weeks and then take a deload, that's more than a month. It's 5 weeks. Like, anyway, you get what I mean. If you're a beginner, you need to vary less, like for the reasons we mentioned before. However, keeping it every 3 or 4 mesocycles, or every kind of block that you're doing, might be worth doing. Again, one of the common issues with variation is using too much. See Westside and the conjugate system, essentially like moving the goalpost to create varying stimulus, but then moving it so often that you essentially get no fucking progress. Cool story, bro. You need enough variation to avoid adaptive resistance, so don't do something so often. So what could be too often? Doing the same exercise for the same sets and same reps for 2 months, 3 months, or 2 mesocycles, 3 mesocycles. If you're a beginner, you might get away with that. If you're anything else, probably not. You probably need to vary up at least volume variable, like volume, the type of exercise, like even just changing it to tempos. Like, next one is varying too often. Again, you need to be able to progress in the exercise to measure if your block and your goals are actually being achieved. Like, this is kind of like your yardstick of how effective your training is if you're seeing increases. Like, again, if you're planning hypertrophy, general things you're looking for are noticeable scale weight increase, assuming you're in a calorie surplus and trying to gain muscle. If you're using hypertrophy training as a recomp slash like cut phase to get less fat, you're looking for scale weight decrease. In the case of a surplus, you are probably should be looking for increases in the weights used. Again, assuming technique is sound and assuming you're keeping the range the same. Cheating, like moving the goalposts to get increases. So, like, again, an example that no one would ever do in the bench is that, like, oh, you're sick benching something for 12s, and then you start cutting it instead of touching, you're cutting it like 1 inch off and doing more weight. Well, fucking of course you are, because you're cutting like 1 inch off. Like, it might not be a lot of weight, but you could definitely move more for 1 inch less, especially considering that's your shittest leverage on the chest. Nobody ever does that with lying down bench press. They either cut it all the time or they don't cut it at all. However, people who don't cut it at all will fucking do it in other things. Like, they'll do it in dumbbell rows, they'll cut squats, they'll cut range on those, like, lateral raise things. They'll start doing it like some sort of autistic seagull and fucking, like, power flapping around. Don't. If you move the goalposts, you're not getting a true identifier of if you are progressing, because you are, like, changing the goal. Stop it. Keep it the same. Figure out a way to make sure you know it's the same. Either film it or have some sort of indicator or some sort of range marker to know, and keep technique controlled and the same range all the fucking time. Dumbbell rows are another one. People look like they're going to start a fight in a bar. They're like shoulder jerking into it. A good idea is that to slow the tempo down on everything, and if you can stop it at any point, it's probably under control. Like, if you're just like dumbbell rowing away and someone has sat there being like, stop, and you can stop it, it's generally under control. If they say stop and you're like, and like rotate into it, not under fucking control at all. But so-and-so does cheat rep. No, cheat reps are fucking stupid. I mean, it's literally in the name. Like, there's no point. You're just using other muscles to shift the weight, pretending like you're doing it with the ones you're meant to be working, for absolutely no benefit whatsoever. Dead point, dead in the water, has no application. Don't fucking say that it does. Go away. Varying, how often is too much for variance? Varying things every mesocycle. That's way too often. Again, even as an advanced lifter, you might even start varying your big bang for buck things. Again, we talked about the things that you're doing your biggest workload from. Varying that. Other common mistakes are using variants that don't adhere to our specificity compass, or our overloading compass, in fact. So, if you try and replace squats with leg extensions, you're not going to get fucking anywhere, because you literally can't. We talked about it in the other video of using your best bang for buck exercise. You need to be able to accrue physical work in the exercise. So the one that you have the most potential for loading for, assuming it's full range. So that's actually quite a good point. So using leg extensions instead of squats, dumb, because you can't leg extend anywhere near the weight that you can squat, and so your quads will be getting way less physical work. Like, the kilos being moved by your quads and other muscles are way less, so don't. If you want to use them for some isolation, like metabolite loading stuff, like you want to occlude your quads and do like tempo leg extensions in a giant set where you try and get like 80 reps in one go with like rest pauses, Mike Menser style, with like an intra-set stretch on the quad or some shit, go do that and have fun, you absolute psychopath. However, don't replace quads. Don't replace squats for that, though. Or leg press or hack squat or whatever you're doing. Another example of that would be doing like quarter squats, which essentially barely hit your quads. Again, your quads mechanical stress applies into hypertrophy, so like the bigger the stretch you can get under load, the better. Same with pretty much everything. Again, if you want, people always focus on the contraction at the top. Fuck that. Focus on the stretch. So like, feel free to try this, but your sets of dumbbell bench, rather than just being like, oh, I'll push them together at the top and squeeze my pecs, rather than that, try take like a 1 second noticeable pause really deep. Like the center of the dumbbell being like below your nipple. Like down here. Stretch that for every rep of every set of 12 that you do in your hypertrophy block and let me know how that goes, because I imagine it will suck a lot. However, you obviously have to keep the stretch or tempo that you're using consistent, because if you don't, that counts to moving the goalposts. You can't spend the first 2 weeks doing 12s being like, slow, controlled, pause, press out, slow, controlled, pause, press out, and then for your third week, just start like hammering them out with like a bounce, and be like, oh, progress, sweet. Doesn't matter, doesn't count. You've just moved the goalposts. It might not seem like much, but it is. Changing the goalposts, so don't, please. Again, you're only fucking yourself. Feel free to do it if you want, but just don't be mad when you don't get anywhere. One thing that is quite important when we're talking about too much variation is that if you vary stuff too much, you essentially have no other variants to go to. Mike Israel had a good analogy for this in one of his videos, where he's like, if you took all of your favorite foods and stuck them on a plate and ate them all after like a couple weeks, like what are you going to eat? Like what's going to be your favorite food? You've literally got bored of all of them at once. Like pick a couple, do it for a few weeks, then when you're bored, go to another couple, do that for a few weeks, and then by that time, the ones you've already used will have come back. Like you will have essentially been like resensitized to how good peanut butter and eggs tastes. It's delicious, by the way. Try it. But yeah, so don't vary too much, but do vary enough. Another mistake some people might make, especially in the powerlifting side of things, is keeping the competition lifts in all year round. You don't need to, especially for hypertrophy stuff. Obviously, you can have squatting variants in it, but not the competition style that you use. Sumo deadlifts have absolutely no place in hypertrophy. They almost, again, if you're training for sumo deadlifts, a whole bunch of your work should be conventional. Like, a load of it. Accessory stuff, like, you can even have them in your strength blocks as an accessory, or like as a supplemental exercise for sumo. Because the issue with sumo, and especially this point applies if you are a very high arch, low stroke range bencher, the point that we talked about mechanical stress and like stretch under load, you don't get that in movements that shorten range of motion. That's kind of why you do it, is so that you optimize leverage by shortening range and taking like the smallest, shortest, straightest route to what you need to do to shift the most weight. So when you are not trying to shift the most weight and trying to get the biggest bang for your buck on muscle gain, you essentially need to do the opposite of what you're doing in strength stuff. So just because so many people pull sumo has nowhere, don't do it in any hypertrophy context ever. Like, just don't. There's not enough range for it to be stimulating enough. Aside from maybe like a sumo squat variant that's super deep, but very few people have the hips to do that, so don't. If you're a sumo puller, you're going to be fairly quad dominant anyway. Don't fuck around with sumos in hypertrophy. Same with bench people. If you have like a bench arch, one of the ones everyone on the internet gets mad about because they don't understand the fucking rules and they think there's some like minimum bench depth or some pish. It's like, aye, cool story, bro. I bet you pull sumo or semi-sumo. That's not a fucking thing. It's sumo if your hands are inside, and it's conventional if your hands are outside. Dead. That's it. There is no in between. You're just either not that wide at sumo. Congrats. If you do the low stroke bench, you need to do a whole ton. But then that opens up a bunch of variants. So if you're like a super arch bencher competitively, all your hypertrophy stuff could be feet up. Like, you could be feet up with just like whatever you can pinch with your shoulders, and like a deep as hell stretch, do tons of dumbbell work, loads of that stuff is going to be super helpful for you. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Have a good day, guys. Next time we're going to be talking about phase potentiation, which is essentially like the big overarching, like looking down at training as like a year type thing, and how to go like, how to stack up your blocks month to month, year to year to like produce optimal success long term. Anyway, catch you later. Have a good day.